Sprint 3 was based around gig signup functionality of the application. Gig signups are a main facet of the current Blueband website, and the site was actually completely dysfunctional this year. So dysfunctional that it led the band to outsource to using a Google Forms account to run gig signups. All functions should be kept in-house, so having the gig signup functionality would be essential in our new app. For this sprint, my goals were as follows. 1. Build an object-oriented front-to-back-end signup that will allow for two different control methods. The first would be for students to allow them to sign up for a gig or cancel that gig signup. And second would be for admins, and they would have the ability to either create or delete a gig. 2. Make gig signups a completely dynamic page. This means that we'd be building it from the ground up, populating it back from the database. 3. Improve the dynamic page building from the attendance taking functionality to allow users to see their attendance real time. And 4. Work to replace generated code with layout code. Doing the amount of work that I did last sprint really helped me streamline the development on the page and enabled me to focus on improvements instead of ground up development. A demo here. So I have all of the different profile logins written down on a sticky note on the side here. So I'm just going to be using certain ones to do specific functions here. So first, let me show you what an admin would see at this moment. So if they go to the attendance tab, they have the opportunity to take attendance. Just like last time, they still have that same drop down where they can pick a rank, and it'll dynamically change who's on that page. They can select a date, and that would be submitted. So because staff doesn't have attendance, there's no attendance here on this page. For gig signup, so these are 4 test cases that I already have back in my SQLite database, and you can see that there's 5 in here. So the reason that there's 5 is it only takes the gigs that are still in the future and puts it on this page. So if a gig is passed, it will no longer present it on this page, but they'll still have that information back in the database. So for instance, gig 1 here is earlier than, what is today, 3/18, so it won't present that on that page. As far as what's in the database, matching it up to what's on this side here. So date is date. All I did is I stored it as a SQL date instead of a local date, just because that's easier for SQLite to look at. Time is based on local time, which is also then transformed into SQL time for database storing. Gig name, description, signed up, chosen, those are all strings. And lastly, open is a Boolean. So I'll get into open in a moment, but the rest of these, so what I'm doing here for signups and for chosen, so every time a gig closes, it takes everybody that's signed up and it essentially makes them chosen. I haven't added official functionality into this yet, but as you can see, if I close a gig like test gig and I reload the database, you can see that whoever was signed up has now been placed in the chosen column, and I'll get more into that later on. So if I was to open that up, for instance, it would wipe whoever's in the chosen column out, obviously because nobody has been chosen due to the gig not closing yet. So other than that, the description is just a short little blurb explaining what the gig would be. So, for instance, let's create a new gig here, and you can see it populate back into the database. So let's have a new gig. Let's call it Team Walk, basic game day, sign up. So the enter the gig description would be meet at whatever time it would be, let's say 7, and lead team into Beaver Stadium. What happens then is when you select a date, as long as it's ahead of today's date, which has been marked, so let's say it's the 25th on a Saturday, the gig is at 8, they meet at 7, 8 o'clock a.m., and leave it open. When I hit submit, it auto reloads the page. You'll see now that Teamwalk is on there, and they have the ability to close it or delete it. So reloading the database, you can see now there is a new gig in there, and the description and the gig name are all there. So this is the basic functionality to the admin controls of the gig. They also have the ability to delete a gig, so if I was to delete that new one that I just made, you'll see that now if I reload the database, there's no gig in there for team walk. So again, that's just another functional part of the app. So moving on from there, I'm going to show you the non-admin controls now for the gig signups. So now jumping back into the app, looking at somebody that doesn't have any admin privileges, you'll see that the UI is changed slightly for the gig signups and the attendance. So the attendance, they won't have any button here. So if they have no attendance in their rank, they will have no attendance on this page. For gig signups, you can see that the UI is different than the last one. They don't have the cancel or delete button or the open or close. All that they have is sign up and cancel sign up. So every time they click sign up or cancel sign up, the page reloads. And what I can do is I can show you back on the back end. So they are signed up for test gig. This is a test, and test gig. This is a test is the names here. So that's going to be these two. So obviously you can see that once they're signed up, they have the ability to cancel, and if they haven't signed up, they're not placed in there yet. So if I sign up for this last one, you'll see that there will be a name appearing here when I reload it. So that's essentially the functionality of the gig sign up page. There's not a whole lot to it. It's fairly simple. It's just a lot of dynamic page building and a lot of backend functionality. Let me find somebody that has attendance in their rank and we'll jump back in. Okay, so now I found somebody that does not have any special admin privileges and they have attendance in their rank. So as you can see, all of their attendance, you'll see true and false. I still need to switch that to either here or not here, present or not present. But this allows them to get a real-time look at their attendance. Other than that, that's essentially all of the functionality that I have, so I'll jump right into the code review. So as far as code, we'll start from the back end and work forward, and we'll try to make this as expedient as possible. So the first we'll start with is just the gig database. So this is just the gig model. Essentially what happens is, you'd call it from main here, just to start it up, and then after that everything is functionable there. So we have connect to database where it just connects, it makes sure that there's no problems connecting, and that happens right off the bat. Get table size. So what this is going to do is this is going to be used for creating a unique primary key that I can use so that no keys are repeated if for some reason the table has columns deleted out of it. As far as another function, so this is the create new gig. This is just an insert into statement for SQL where the values are all placed in a prepared statement and then it's all executed. So you'll see table size is that primary key that I was talking about. You have date, time, gig name, description, who has been signed up, who's been chosen, and who's open, and whether or not it's open. So signed up and chosen are both null all the time when a gig is created. They won't be not null until somebody has signed up for the gig and then it's closed. Sign up is very simple. So all it does is it selects based off of that gig ID, which I mentioned is that primary key that I'm using right off the bat. What's happening there is they're being selected, and then it's just updating where they've been selected with essentially their PSU ID and a separator, and that's being added into the database. So if you can see, each one of these has a comma in between. So I'm just using that as a separator as they get added in. Changing the gig status. So I wrote this in one method. Instead of writing an open and a close method, what I did is I just added in a boolean telling the status. So when it's closing, the boolean will be false. When it's opening, it'll be true. If it's true, then what'll happen is it'll just wipe that entire statement. And then if it's false, what'll happen is it'll take all of the people from that who's been chosen. So everybody that who has signed up so far will automatically be placed in there. I'm thinking about an algorithm based off of whether they're a guide, a squad leader, a section leader, or an officer. We'll figure that out later on if I have more time, and it'll also be based off of instrument later on. So those are just some improvements that I'm going to add down the line. Other than that, there's a delete gig, which is just a delete from statement that is called through SQL, and a cancel sign up that it changes, what it does is it looks for all the separators, it splits the string, and then takes that specific PSU ID out of that string and closes the string back up. And then you have the get open gigs is used for populating all of the gigs for admins and for users. This is basically anything where it's an open gig, and it's not later than the current date, so or not earlier than the current date, so making sure that it hasn't happened yet. There's also a create gig object, so I'll get to the gig object in a second, but this is where it would be called from here to do all the signups. So again, this is for the most part going to be null for a lot of the creation. And then what'll happen is it'll split all of the one string that I'm using for signed up and chosen. It'll split that into a string array. In signed up and chosen are both string arrays that are created into the new gig. There's also an array list to get all gigs, so this is for only admins. This is when they are on that page. Whether a gig is open or closed, they'll be able to see both. So then going into the gig object, it has a gig ID, a date, a time, name, description, and then these are the two string arrays that I told you. So it breaks up that one individual string that I have here. It breaks that up into multiple parts of an array so that it can be used object-oriented throughout the application. And let's see here. So that's basically the back end and the object. This is the gig signups page. So this is quite a hefty load of UI. This is not auto-generated. This is all written code here. So all of this is just, initializing variables, getting through here. So I have an add components method where it places all the navigation components. Those are the components at the bottom of the screen, as well as the page components, which is the main bulk of the screen. Placing navigation components, this is the same for all the pages, and I'll copy this over to any pages that don't have it. This is just adding in those buttons, the gig signups, attendance, home, announcements, calendar, those bottom buttons at the bottom of the page that are used for navigation. That's all that this does. As far as the page components, it has a specific layout. I believe it's spring layout. And then what I did is just adding in the button, and then the rest of this is all dynamic. So I'll get into that. This is all complicated. So for an admin, this is somebody that has that button at the top of the page where they're allowed to create a new gig. All of these buttons, so button 1, button 2, these are both dynamic buttons. So the reason I don't have them named is actually because some of them have different purposes. So button 1, for instance, it can be close or open, depending on what the open value is in the database. So these are all where I'm adding everything into the panel, and other than that, it's a whole lot of just adding them, adding specifics to where they're going to be, and then all I do is I add this spacer down here that allows it to build and go down the page at the same time. So you're talking, one after the other after the other. So every time I add spacer in here, this is a variable that is instanced up here above the for loop. So every time that it goes through the for loop, it adds 80 there. Okay, 80 to 60, and then when it's down into the put constraints, this is essentially the Y and this is the X. So it'll build as it goes along. And again, it's the same thing for students. Students will have the exact same function building. It's just different spaces. So again, it's 40 instead of 80 because it's only one line instead of two. And then again, these are just all the functions. So you'll see cancel, sign up, performed. There's a reload page called after each one of these things that would change something on the screen. And again, some of these are used for specific users, some of these are not. So for instance, the delete action performed is only going to come up for an admin, but it's still in the same method just because everything's built dynamically. The next sprint will focus on overall improvements as well as the announcements and itinerary page. The bulk of the difficult process has been handled in the first 3 sprints. Overall, this was a good sprint. I got a ton of work done regarding the dynamic page building. Moving into sprint 4, I'm doing well and I'm on track to completing this app on time.